Hello class, and welcome to this discussion on Christianity, wisdom, and health. Formerly that third word was truth, but I thought health a more appropriate third word as we talk about the relationships that are key to this lecture presentation. Think about the following question. If practitioners of religions other than Christianity have discovered truths or insights about health and have had health benefits from their religious practices, how might Christians think about and appropriate such knowledge, and how might they think about these other religions and their healthy practices for their practitioners? This is one of the central questions that is steering this present lecture presentation. First, let's think about the word wisdom. What does it mean to be wise? When you think of someone who is wise, what comes to mind? What kind of characteristics? Who are specific individuals in your life that you think of as wise? Moving on to the second question here about wisdom then, what kinds of knowledge and or understandings do you think wisdom includes? So the people in your life that you consider wise, what is it that makes them wise? What is it about life? What do they know or understand? What kind of perspectives do they have? What is it about them that makes them wise? What is it that they possess that you would consider wisdom? If we move into some of the biblical material, both Old and New Testaments that we are exploring for the present discussion, I took you through the readings into the life of Solomon, who is the third king of the people of Israel in ancient Israel. One of the things for which King Solomon was known was his wisdom. When you're reading the biblical narratives about King Solomon's rule over the people of Israel, very early in his rulership over the people of Israel, you read a story in 1 Kings chapter 3, not one of your assigned readings, but you read a story about King Solomon praying to God for wisdom. And one of the things in that prayer and in what follows that you discover about the character of wisdom in the case of Solomon is that wisdom is something that comes from God. God is regarded as the source of wisdom. And secondly, in 1 Kings chapter 3, there's kind of a test case after the prayer is had, after the conversation between Solomon and God takes place. Solomon is then given a real-life opportunity to test his wisdom, to test his discernment and judgment. And in this particular case, in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon's wisdom has to do with being able to discern, to make judgment calls when he's presented with a human conflict. Two people come to him with a disagreement, a dispute, and Solomon has to make a judgment call. And he makes the correct call, and he receives accolades for his wisdom as a result. But this is not all that the biblical narrative has to say about Solomon the wise. In the very next chapter, 1 Kings chapter 4, you read about the scope of Solomon's wisdom. And this was your assigned text from 1 Kings chapter 4. Just verses 29 through 34, and the narrator of this text has the following to say about King Solomon. That Solomon would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in the Lebanon, an example of which is depicted for you in the bottom right, to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. That is, when you're reading 1 Kings chapter 3, the scope of wisdom so far in the narrative includes just discerning human conflict and dispute. By the time you get to the end of chapter 4, you see that the scope of Solomon's wisdom included knowledge about nature, trees and animals, things that were part of the natural world, characteristics of them, how they worked, any available knowledge that may have been available to Solomon and other high-ranking and literate persons in Israel and their neighbors. Any knowledge that was available in the natural world, it's likely that Solomon was privy to some of it and may have even contributed some of his own unique understandings based on investigation of these things. Which brings up this question. How is this nature wisdom acquired in the case of Solomon? You read 1 Kings 4 and you say, okay, I get it. Solomon's wisdom includes wisdom or knowledge about nature wisdom. Well, how did he get this wisdom? Are we to imagine that God directly gave Solomon knowledge about trees and animals? Almost like The Matrix. If you've seen the Matrix trilogy, you know that one of the things that occurs in the Matrix movies is that they can hook up to a program and download instantly something they didn't know how to do. So fly a helicopter or drive a, or not so much drive a motorcycle, but there's this case in the second Matrix movie where Trinity has downloaded into her brain a program for how to hotwire a motorcycle. And actually in that scene, before she has to do so, there's a person that's with her who actually has a key to that motorcycle. And that's part of the storyline of Matrix. I don't want to digress too much, even though I love the Matrix movies. So much as to say that when we think about wisdom, do we think of it, nature wisdom in the case of Solomon, as a downloadable program that God just instantly downloads onto Solomon? Or do we imagine that one of the ways Solomon acquires his nature wisdom is by getting out into nature, studying nature, learning more about nature and how nature works, and maybe even reading sources that were available to him on other people in neighboring cultures and what they had learned about nature and how nature works? Solomon would have been literate, and depending on what kinds of literature was available to him, he may well have had in his palace or in his courts some of this nature wisdom available from other neighboring cultures. If there were people in Babylon, for instance, who had learned a lot about plants and animals and they shared that with Solomon, Solomon probably would have wanted to know that and would have drawn on that to increase his wisdom. So even if wisdom's source is ultimately found in God, how is that mediated? How does wisdom come to people? Is it always just instant download, or is there work that is involved on the part of people to acquire that wisdom? Closely connected to the narratives and the person of King Solomon, there's this collection of wise sayings from ancient Israel. There are three major wisdom books: the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. But the book of Proverbs is almost always closely connected with the person of Solomon, and I pointed you to three particular texts in the book of Proverbs to display some things about the character of wisdom as ancient Israel understood it. So in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, you saw toward the end of this section that I assigned to you the following statement made: "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." And two things are really kept close together in this kind of statement. Fear of the Lord is a way of referring to the picture on the right, where you have the Word of God revealed through the law. You have people who in everyday life are committed to God's ways and they are devoted to God. You have what we might consider a more religious dimension of life in view. But then on the left side, you have a person reflecting and acquiring wisdom through careful observation, deep, thoughtful reflection, and even sharing with others and learning from others. So you have this maybe what we might consider a more natural way of acquiring wisdom through personal reflection, but then you have the fear of the Lord, where there's this relationship with the Lord that expands and enhances and provides an appropriate context for any other wisdom that you might gain. So the idea is that, that what Israel is expressing here is that the fear of the Lord, being in a committed relationship with the Lord, the God of Israel, is the beginning of true wisdom. And this is not saying that no one outside of Israel can achieve wisdom. And I'll show a couple of examples of why that's the case. So this is not indicating that no one, that only Israel is capable of acquiring wisdom because only Israel feared the Lord, only Israel was in relationship with the Lord. This is a way of saying that Israel's relationship with the Lord clarified for them the wisdom that they might gain through any other means. And so it is fully possible for peoples and cultures neighboring and well beyond the borders of Israel to acquire wisdom and to know some things about the world and how the world worked and to develop insights into how the world works. And to harness those things, perhaps even for their health, for example. But that does not mean that people outside of Israel could achieve all the wisdom there was to gain and could learn everything they needed to learn about God through just common human observation and acquisitions of wisdom. What's really going on here is that Israel believed that its relationship with God gave the appropriate framework and context for learning everything else they learned. I pointed you also to Proverbs chapter 3 and chapter 8. Proverbs 3 verse 19 says, "The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens." Here at the bottom left you have a picture that faithfully represents cosmology as the ancient people of Israel understood it, and people in the ancient Near Eastern world as a whole. They did not think of the world structured the way you and I do based on subsequent centuries of scientific investigation of the world. They had some forms of scientific inquiry and investigation into the character of the world, but they had limits on what they could learn about the world. So within the framework of their cosmology, within the framework of their world as they understood it, they thought, the people of Israel thought about God, they looked to God, and they, in passages like this, express their belief that God made use of wisdom as he designed and created, as he made the heavens and the earth and everything in them. And so there's this intimate connection between nature, between the creation, and wisdom. A similar thing is expanded upon in Proverbs 8:22 through 31, where wisdom is no longer treated as an abstract topic, but treated as a person, a woman, Lady Wisdom, who it's as if Lady Wisdom is addressing you as the reader and speaking to you and saying, "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth." A view of which is depicted here, where you have darkness over the surface of deep, deep, dark waters. This is the kind of picture that is being imagined in the earliest verses of Genesis. "Then I was beside God," wisdom says, "like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race." So here you have this marvelous portrayal of wisdom as a woman who is speaking to the reader and is telling the reader, "I was there with God before the whole world was made, and I was with him every step along the way as he was making the world and as the world came to take the shape that it now has." And precisely because this is the case, because wisdom was there before the beginning, and because wisdom was there every step along the way, it means that there's this intimate connection between wisdom and the natural world. Therefore, those who carefully study and analyze the natural world and come to an understanding of what it is like, how it works, and how it came to be the way it is, those people have unique insights into the nature of wisdom. They develop wisdom by studying the natural world, and they even gain some help in clarifying what God is like, since this is God's own wisdom that has been involved in creating. So there's this intimate connection between the pursuit of wisdom and the investigation of nature. Lastly, I'll point out to you rather briefly that this gets far deeper than I'm able to go with you in this lesson and this course as a whole, but that there are foreign proverbs that are included in Israel's Proverbs. And you find some of these in Proverbs chapters 22, 24, and 30 and 31. So perhaps from ancient Egypt or ancient Babylon, there are sources of wisdom that are older than Israel's Proverbs and that have been incorporated in some cases nearly, if not exactly word for word, into the Hebrew scriptures depicted here with this Hebrew scroll. And the reason I point this out for you is because if Israel believed that only they who feared the Lord were capable of acquiring wisdom, then why would they read the wisdom literature of other cultures and make use of those proverbs in their own collection of proverbs? This tells you something where Israel is holding this balance between believing that they're in special relationship with God, but that there still are insights available that other cultures who don't know their God, who don't fear their God, these other cultures still have been able to arrive at some truths. When we talk about the Second Temple period and Jews in the Second Temple period, we basically are referring to the 500s BC up until around the year 70 AD. This is the time period during which The second temple, and not Solomon's temple, that temple was destroyed in the 580s BC. That temple was in part rebuilt later on in the five teens BC. And that second Jewish temple stood from the 5 teens BC, roughly 515 BC, until 70 AD, so over 500 years, this second temple stood in the city of Jerusalem until it was destroyed by the Romans, and this is after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. There are various Jewish writings that emerge during the Second Temple Jewish period. One of them is this book that I sent you to, or included as a PDF for you for this week. It's called The Wisdom of Solomon. And you need to have read the introduction to that book. I don't want to go into all the details, but basically the scholars of this book believe that it was written somewhere between 30 BC and 41 AD, that it was written in Egypt and by a Greek-speaking Jew. And in this chapter, chapter 7 of the Wisdom of Solomon, one of the things you saw in verses 17 through 21 was the following excerpt. And the author is presenting this as if it were Solomon speaking the words. So you are to imagine, even though this was written hundreds of years after Solomon's life, you're supposed to imagine with the author of this book that it is Solomon talking to you. And so you imagine Solomon saying, "For it is he," referring to God, "it is God who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements, the beginning and end and middle of times, the alternations of solstices and the changes of the seasons, the cycles of the year and the constellations of the stars, the natures of animals and the tempers of wild animals, the powers of spirits and the thoughts of human beings, the varieties of plants and the virtues of roots." As we did with the biblical narrative of Solomon back in 1 Kings 4, so also here we have in view the scope of wisdom. We have a Second Temple Jewish author imagining that Solomon is talking to him and to his own audience and telling this audience how much wisdom God gave him and what all that wisdom included. Once again, for a Jewish person living centuries and centuries after Solomon, this person believed that wisdom included nature wisdom, having a fairly expansive, comprehensive understanding of things that are going on in the natural world. So the structure of the world, the elements, the times, the solstices, the seasons, the years, the constellations, animals, wild animals, spirits, humans, plants, roots, all of these dimensions of the natural world, of the author's world, he believed were within the scope of what Solomon the Wise knew and understood. So this tells you not just what the author thought about Solomon from the past, this tells you what the author thought wisdom continued to include. That wisdom in his own time period included a knowledge of nature and how it worked. And when you read this text carefully in verses 17 and 21 and 22, we find out some of what this author thought about the sources of wisdom. That this Jewish author credited wisdom as coming from God, but also that there were learning processes involved, investigation of the natural world. So once again, not so much that God had downloaded a program onto Solomon, so much as Solomon had to work hard to learn about the natural world, and that through that hard work, the fruit, the result was a mediated gift from God, that God so set up the world that those who would investigate and learn from nature carefully would become wiser in the process. As we move forward a little bit into the New Testament period, I'm not going to cover a whole lot in terms of the ways in which New Testament authors associated wisdom with the person of Jesus. But suffice it to say that when we follow the theme of wisdom in the New Testament, very often what different authors are getting at is that they're trying to articulate that what God has done in Jesus, this man who emerged from Galilee, who preached, who gathered disciples, who healed people, who performed other signs and wonders. He cast out demons. He walked on the water. He multiplied loaves and fishes. But he also taught people about loving their enemies and turning the other cheek. He taught them about hatred and lust and murder and taking oaths. All the things that Jesus said and did, culminating in him being killed, executed by the powers that were in authority in his day, that all of this is an expression of the wisdom of God. And for our purposes here, in thinking about the natural world and investigations of the natural world, there are within this frame of mind some thoughts in the New Testament about Jesus being an expression of God's creation wisdom. That wisdom that you saw that was involved in the creating and the making of the world, and was with the world every step along the way, that this is associated very intimately with Jesus and who Jesus was and what God was doing in Jesus. So the two are very intimately connected, as demonstrated here from the words of the Apostle Paul in Colossians chapter 1. Paul says, "He," referring to Jesus, "is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together." See, Paul, being a Jew of the Second Temple period, was thinking much like other Jews thought about the wisdom of God. That wisdom was with God before the creation. Wisdom is what God used to do the creating, and wisdom has been part of the creative process ever since, throughout the whole history of the world. Paul sees the God that is revealed in Jesus and the God that is revealed in creation wisdom, nature wisdom, as being the same God. And therefore there's this deep consonance between Jesus and nature. So when you look to the cross and the empty tomb as these magnificent displays of what God's power and what God is trying to do through Jesus, that is deeply consonant with the whole creation project. That these aren't two different projects, as if God started out doing one kind of thing in creating the world and then changed his mind and said, no, I'm going to focus on something else altogether different. Jesus and creation are not kept apart as two completely distinct ideas. These are two deeply enmeshed, interconnected expressions of the activity of the one God of the universe. Lastly, I took you to Justin Martyr. Martyr is not his last name. Martyr is a description of the fate that he suffered around the year 165 AD. This is at a time and in a set of places where Christians suffered persecution at the hands of those who were not Christians and were in positions of social and political authority. So Justin suffered a martyr's death in 165 AD. He had grown up as a what he would call perhaps a pagan. He was not a Christian. He was not born in a Christian household. And he grew up learning all kinds of philosophy from the philosopher Plato. I mean, he didn't know Plato. He lived hundreds of years after Plato. But he studied the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, Zeno, the Stoics, the Epicureans, various philosophers and philosophies from the Greek world. He was very well acquainted with them, and this was his background. Well, when he converted to Christianity, he spent a significant amount of time thinking about all this philosophy, all this wisdom that he had tried to achieve through the Greek philosophers. And as he thought about the relationship between these people who weren't part of Israel, they weren't part of God's Christian people, they were outside of this tradition. And when he thought about those people who were outsiders from the community that he had now joined, he gave some critical thought to the knowledge these people believed they had gained. And here are some of the things he had to say. "For I myself, when I discovered the wicked disguise which the evil spirits had thrown around the divine doctrines of the Christians, to turn aside others from joining them, laughed both at those who framed these falsehoods and at the disguise itself, and at popular opinion." Pause. What Justin is saying is, he is recounting his own story where he thought carefully that he lived in a world where people claimed that that what Christians were advocating was so completely at odds with everything that all the smart people from history had ever said, that Christians weren't worth joining. This was not a group worth converting to and becoming part of. And so there were those people who tried to attack Christianity during the days of Justin Martyr and tried to point out, basically, look at how pathetic this is. Look at what these people believe and teach and how they live their lives. And look at the kinds of social classes that gravitate to Christianity. They're just not a very respectable bunch in any sense of the word. And so Justin Martyr, who has left paganism, left pagan philosophy, and joined the Christian movement, looks at this and he laughs. He says that there's a big disguise and a big deception going on here. All right, so we continue. And I confess that I both boast and with all my strength strive to be found a Christian. That is, he's not ashamed that he had studied all the smart people, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and so on, that I'd studied all the smart people and then joined the Christians. He boasts in that. He's not ashamed of that. And he goes on to say here in the highlighted part, not because the teachings of Plato are different from those of Christ, but because they are not in all respects similar. That is, there's a lot of overlap between some things that Justin saw a significant amount of overlap in what he learned from Plato and what he learned from Jesus. As neither are those of the others, Stoics and poets and historians. That is, Justin listens to the critics around him, the critics of Christianity, and he says, okay, look, so there are some differences between Christianity and the teachings of Plato. There are also differences between the teachings of Plato and the teachings of Aristotle and the teachings of the Stoics and the teachings of the poets like Hesiod and Homer, for instance. In other words, you guys act like you're united in your attack on Christianity, but you all don't agree with each other. That's what Justin is doing here. So he's saying two things. First of all, there's overlap between the wisdom that these non-Christian people gained. Many of them were pre-Christian people. So these pre-non-Christian people said some things that overlap and agree with the teachings of Jesus, number one. Number two, they don't all agree with each other. So it's not like they all have a common grievance against Christianity. They argue with each other. Then this last highlighted line here. He says, for each man spoke well, in proportion to the share he had of the spermatic word, seeing what was related to it. There's a lot going on here in Justin's language, but basically what he is saying is when he talks about word, spermatic word, word is, he has in mind the Word of God that has been revealed and spoken in incremental ways throughout history, and he ultimately has in view that that Word became flesh in Jesus. But he's working with the idea that there was a seed of that Word of God, hence spermatic word, that was given by God to people who weren't part of the people of Israel or the Christians. So God's truth was available in part to people who were outside of the Israel and Jesus communities. But they who contradict themselves on the more important points appear not to have possessed the wisdom and the knowledge which cannot be spoken against. That is, even though they had some of God's spermatic word planted within them, and even though they were able to acquire and speak some truths, they were not able to acquire full wisdom, full truth from what they had available to them. This is Justin's view. Whatever things were rightly said among all men are the property of us Christians. This is not Justin trying to plagiarize and say, anybody that said anything that was true, we're going to pretend that it was our people that said it. It's not so much that as to say that Justin is saying, look guys, if God has a word that's been revealed in various ways, in various cultures, truths that have been discovered by various peoples, and even if they spoke that thing imperfectly, that truth is still something that Christians can accept and welcome. For next to God, we worship and love the Word. He has in mind Jesus here. John chapter 1, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We worship and love the Word, who is from the unbegotten and ineffable God, since he also became a man for our sakes, that becoming a partaker of our sufferings, he might also bring us healing. Here he describes his view of the Jesus-God relationship. For all the writers were able to see realities darkly through the sowing of the implanted word that was in them. In other words, all these philosophers who were outside of the Israel, Jesus, Christian community, who were able to speak some truths, they were able to see realities, real things, real truths, but partially, darkly. Some of them did very well with what was available to them. For the seed and imitation imparted according to capacity is one thing, and quite another is the thing itself, of which there is the participation and imitation according to the grace which is from him. Basically, the last statement is Justin's way of saying that you have people who have a limited amount of perception of God's truth, and that's different than the truth itself that is revealed only and most clear, or not only, but most clearly in Jesus. Those are two distinct things. So then, when we think a big picture about the topic before us, Christianity, wisdom, and health, we think about the Koenig text and what we have learned from Harold Koenig's research, that practitioners of various modern religions are healthier as a result of their religiously motivated choices. So praying Hindus in India seem to be healthier than non-praying Hindus in India. Devout Orthodox Jews in Israel seem to demonstrate signs, indicators, objective indicators of better health than non-practicing, non-Orthodox, secular Jews in Israel, and so on and so forth. If this is the case, then in light of these Old Testament texts we looked at about wisdom and how it was acquired and what all it included, the New Testament passages we looked at, and Justin, this Christian predecessor of ours, how might Christians today appropriate knowledge claims and beneficial health practices from sources that are outside of Christianity? That's really one of our key operative summative questions here that I hope is a question we will carry with us into our discussion, item 612. Before that, you'll do the week 6 study questions. There's just a handful of them for you, and as with all the others, they are open book and they are untimed. You will then move into your final component for this week, this discussion of Christianity, wisdom, and health, where you discuss with each other one thing you learned from the readings and this lecture that will shape how you view the religion-health relationship.